so much to Malvern for hosting us, and for everyone who came out. I'm actually going to read the one and only piece of nonfiction I've ever written. It's an essay called CIA versus MFA, or MFA versus CIA, I guess. When I was 23, I was hired by the CIA. I was working at a Catholic school at the time, coaching squash and teaching 7th grade social studies, which was funny since I'd never before seen a squash game and was not even so much a lapsed Catholic. I lived behind the school in a former convent where the only consistently functioning lights were a pair of glowing red exit signs. My prevailing feeling that year was one of intense personal absurdity, and it was in this spirit that I applied to the CIA. I liked international relations, and who knew they had an online application, and the Iowa Writers' Workshop. I liked writing stories, and what the hell. These things certainly didn't make any less sense than coaching squash and living in a convent, though they weren't really ambitions as much as gestures, reflections of my general hope that I would someday do something else. Each was something in between, a dice roll and a delusion, a promissory note and a private joke to no one but myself. Later, it turned out that this was a lot like what writing a novel would feel like. In some ways, it's hard to imagine paths more different than being a writer and being a spy. It's certainly hard to imagine two careers with such wildly disparate stakes. And yet there are parallels in the underlying qualities of their practitioners. An interest in psychology, a facility with narrative, a tendency to position oneself as an observer, a willingness to lie and call it something else. In The Great Game, The Myths and Reality of Espionage, which by the way is a terrible book, Frederick P. Hitz notes that one of the requirements of a good intelligence officer is a profound understanding of human nature. Spy running involves a carefully choreographed pulling of psychic marionette strings, threads of desire and ambition, paranoia and greed, ideology and pragmatism, all unique to the individual in question and to their broader cultural and geopolitical context. Vanities and resentments are especially important, and CIA officers must play to these without ever seeming to know what they are. Intelligence failures, like literary ones, tend to stem from failures of empathetic imagination. We do not generally think of spying as an exercise in empathy, since its results are rarely benign. But insight into another person is a tool like any other. Everything depends on what you do with it. And empathy forms the only springboard from which we can hope to access that insight. Spies must be empathetic in order to gain understanding and ruthless in using it. In some ways, this is the real-world counterpart of the kind of empathy writers extend toward their characters. Novelists spend years conjuring fictional people, intricately constructing backstories, lovingly sketching minds, so that they can be made to react plausibly to whatever horrors have been planned for them all along. The stakes of this process are, in the scheme of things, non-existent. Yet to be good at it does demand a non-squeamish imagination, as well as a high tolerance for what Keats called negative capability, the capacity to accept uncertainties, to sustain incompatible possibilities. This is an uncommon quality, I think. Like insight itself, much depends on how it's used. It lets us consider ideas we don't completely believe in, inhabit perspectives we don't totally endorse. It lets us linger too long in liminal spaces where we don't necessarily want to stay. A few weeks after my application, the CIA contacted me for a phone interview. I was surprised by this, less by the fact that my resume had passed some very initial scrutiny than that somebody had read it in the first place. This, combined with a quick turnaround, left me in the very weird and possibly unprecedented position of being impressed with the honesty of the Central Intelligence Agency and the efficiency of the federal government. The phone interview was brief and went objectively poorly. The request for written material that came a short time later seemed like it had to be a clerical error, though I wasn't shocked when my essays vaulted me to the next round, an interview and information session in Boston. During that interview, my one great triumph was in ranking the significance of various objects in a hypothetical scenario. In retrospect, it is tempting to call this a kind of storytelling, and in a way, this is precisely what intelligence work is, a blend of inductive reasoning and formally constrained fiction writing. It's intuitively appealing, and for me, appealingly benign, to make this the entire explanation. I was hired by the CIA because I'm a writer. But I'm hesitant to oversell this theory, especially to myself. Look at the available information and blend it into a plausible through line. This is what intelligence analysis is, yes, but it's also what this essay is, which makes that conclusion feel a little circular. I spent the summer after college working at a movie theater and reading my way through the CIA's recommended book list. The books on the list were very good, it turned out, and contained an unexpected range of perspectives about the CIA, not all of them flattering. I was struck by this, that an employer would want prospective candidates to know the complaints of disaffected former employees. This seemed, once again, surprisingly transparent, and it was a long time before I wondered if that wasn't part of the point. At the time, I appreciated CIA's interest in having informed candidates and was increasingly interested in being one. I was particularly interested in being informed as to why I was a candidate in the first place. For a while, this was an extremely fun question to consider. The notion of actually being hired still felt safely fantastical, so the idea that the CIA might see some quality in me that I did not see in myself was exciting, not yet frightening. Particularly in my less triumphant moments, cleaning the bathroom of the movie theater, scraping Creed-on ice off the windshield before another tragicomic squash practice, I liked to speculate about what these special qualities of mine might be. Compounding my curiosity was the radio silence from jobs in the normal world. I'd applied to dozens of entry-level positions and could barely get a rejection, and though I was frustrated about this, I was not really surprised. The economy was bad, and I wasn't the sort of person who tended to stand out, either on paper or in person. In fact, I could not ever remember being overestimated before this one ludicrous example. Though that's a hard thing to know about yourself, other parties might beg to disagree. What is certain is that I was routinely slightly underestimated. I knew because people were always telling me they'd done it. At the time, this bothered me a little less than I knew it probably should. It was not a good thing to be thought less than you were. The drawbacks were obvious. Yet it did seem you could learn things this way. Writers and spies share an ability and a willingness to hide in plain sight, to deflect attention not only from the nature of their role, but from the fact that they have any role at all. A spy obscures his relationships to events in order to affect them, just as a writer hovers anonymously beyond the page in order to exert her tyrannical, obsessive control. What is authorial distance, anyway, but a form of plausible deniability? This willingness to disappear is another difficult quality to gauge in normal terms. It seems to simultaneously be a form of delusional arrogance and also its exact opposite. But both writers and spies understand its uses. In both cases, it is the vanishing act that enables the sorcery. In the fall, I began my teaching job. I wasn't the only one to notice I wasn't great at it. Maybe jobs aren't for me, I thought, and applied to MFA programs. And then I was invited to Washington, D.C. for a 3-day interview. As one does with unforeseen outcomes, I began to make a retroactive case for inevitability, not of my future position as a CIA officer, but of my present position as an apparently viable CIA candidate. For this, according to the CIA itself, was what I was, and this fact was too bizarre to be meaningless. I still felt almost totally sure I would not get the job. Beyond the candidate evaluation lay a vast labyrinth of security clearance assessments from which it seemed almost nobody emerged. But it was time to seriously entertain the possibility. It was also time to reconsider the question of whether I wanted this job. I'd wanted it all along, of course, but more like someone who wants to go to space someday, and less like someone who wants to leave for a mission to Mars in 6 months. It was an issue that needed revisiting in light of this new, apparently literal reality. Another was the ethical question, heretofore academic or at most civic. I believed in the necessity of the CIA. I respected many of the things it did or tried to do, and was, like all sane people, horrified by many others. I'd raised some of these issues in my initial interviews, but more as a citizen in a unique position to learn how she should regard actions undertaken on her behalf than as a person contemplating undertaking any particular action herself. Should morally alert people shun the CIA, or are they the very people we most need working for it? I thought about this question in the way I thought about a lot of questions. As a philosophy major, I was going to have to think if there was another way to think. It is fair to say that I had doubts. But doubts, I reasoned reasonably, were not a reason not to go to Washington. Doubts were a reason to go and get more information. And maybe they were, but the bigger thing was this: I was curious. Here is a common paradox of curiosity in parables and in life. A condition of knowing the truth is to never, never tell it. When it comes to writing for publication, CIA's terms are stark. Once you have been under their employ, everything you write for the rest of your life will be subject to their review and redaction. The CIA emphasizes that these redactions apply only to matters of natural security, that a potential novelist would not, for example, be forfeiting her artistic autonomy for a lifetime, which is a question I think I actually asked. And for what it's worth, I believe this. But then, how could we ever know? Who would ever tell us? To be a spy is to permanently relinquish authorial agency, to become the protagonist of a highly interesting plot. While I worried over the integrity of my non-existent future book, other more concrete trade-offs were at hand. Intelligence officers work undercover, either commercial or diplomatic, and establishing it begins long before you're hired. People will want to know why you're going to Washington, and why you're going back again so soon, and why a security clearance investigator is showing up at their house to ask about your recreational drug use. The application process involved a few thrilling encounters with secrecy before this point, but now I was going to have to actively practice it. The first step was deciding who not to lie to. This was something applicants were encouraged to consider very, very carefully. I told my mother and my boyfriend. Later, an alert friend quietly got it and never said so. For both of these things, I was immensely grateful. In retrospect, I'm a little amazed no one seemed to consider I might just be going nuts. I was 23, exactly the right age for a psychotic break. This must have struck me as an obvious explanation even then. One of my first short stories at Iowa a year later was about a man who recounts his recruitment by the agency, and by the end you realize that none of what he's saying is actually happening, and really he's just going crazy. It was a first attempt at an unreliable narrator, I guess, though I've never liked that term. It implies that some narrators aren't unreliable, and I stopped believing that around the time I realized that I was an unreliable narrator myself. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. Cover is partly about what you say, that you are applying for a job with the State Department, and partly about how you say it. I described my prospective position as stamping visas, making a point of sounding a little ambivalent about the job and embarrassed by the rigmarole, but excited about traveling to adventurous places, all of which was true. Then I changed the subject. But it couldn't actually be that simple, could it? I asked this in one of my interviews. A few months after my first round of assessments, an invitation came for a second. Dazed, I went. I was sitting across from a genial former intelligence officer. Out in the real world, I said, was it really just a matter of changing the subject? Yes, he said, a lot of the time it was. What people everywhere really want to talk about is themselves. This was something I'd always suspected, deep in my misanthropic heart. But to hear it said out loud in this way made the observation something useful, a helpful tip for all kinds of scenarios, not only ones involving security clearance. This is one of the things I learned that still matters to me. Here are some others. My first round of interviews involved the delivery of memorized briefings. Mine were on the takeover of the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia and the death of an important tribal leader in Baluchistan, which is another way of saying I had a subscription to The Economist. At the time, I had a phobia of public speaking that was crippling even before a civilian audience. From this, I learned that I could operate while terrified. There was a battery of testing, intellectual and psychological, as well as follow-up conversations with the CIA psychiatrist. From this, I learned that my psychological profile suggested a contempt for authority, which was news to me, since I'd never behaved contemptuously toward authority in my life, as far as I can recall. But then, in a purely philosophical sense, deep down, now that they mentioned it, one of the questions on the psych exam asked whether it was true or false that you, the applicant, had never wished to be a gender other than your own. This flummoxed me. Had I never wished to be a man? Were they kidding? Were they aware of the terms of being a woman? I left it blank. Later, the psychiatrist winked at me over his eyeglasses. The most interesting evaluations were ones whose metrics seemed to shift. You'd think they were looking at one thing, and it wound up being another. I had decent instincts in these situations, and even though they were confusing and often sort of socially unpleasant, I obscurely enjoyed them. Later, this shifting of terms would turn out to be one of my favorite tricks of fiction, the epic poem's hijacking by a deposed king in pale fire. I found myself unfazed by the hostility and trickery they involved, maybe because it didn't matter, or maybe because it did, and uncharacteristically unyielding, even assertive, under their particular kind of pressure. Maybe I did have the ability to enter an ethical morass and do the right thing, I thought, a reassuring idea in light of the ominous moral question still looming overhead. But even then, I knew that the point wasn't entirely ethical, but epistemological. If I could never see the larger plot, I could never know what role I was playing in it. This is how novels break your heart, those final pages of Middlemarch, and thinking about this still haunts me. This does too. If I didn't know what a storyteller I was yet, who knows what stories I might have wound up telling myself. The experience haunts my writing too in some respects. Some of this is pretty straightforward. Espionage has a tendency to weasel itself into my novels, and once it's there, crash a plane. There are quieter resonances as well. Many of my characters feel a sense of their unlived lives flickering around them. In my first few years of writing, almost all of my narrators were men. As both a writer and reader, I seem to possess a spheroidal sense of credulity. That wouldn't happen, I hear my workshop colleagues say later on. The thing about things that wouldn't happen is that once in a while they do. These are interesting stories, if there is anyone to tell them. My conditional offer of employment came in the winter. By this point, my surprise had settled into a queasy disorientation I wasn't quite willing to admit was fear. My security investigation was launched. I met with my investigator, an amiable middle-aged woman, in a hotel off the highway. She asked if I had any questions, which by then I did not. I knew the investigation would be rigorous, and it was. Most COE candidates do not pass their security clearance and are never told why. But here, for the first time, I liked my odds. I lived in a convent, for Christ's sake, and my rebellious streak was purely theoretical, according to official CIA testing. The investigator interviewed my childhood friends and their parents, my boyfriend and his startled roommates. She asked them about my international trips and foreign national contacts, and whether I had been known to smoke marijuana, and if so, when. The investigator showed up unannounced at the school where I worked, endearing me further to everyone. She drove to my hometown several hours west to interview my mother. When I was there over winter break, a car tailed me for 20 minutes, late at night, through the deserted woods. Perhaps that's the CIA, I thought, and thought about how those were the sorts of thoughts I had now. Sometime during the strange season, I got a voicemail from the Iowa Writers' Workshop asking